Hello, everyone, and welcome to Critical Thinking Through English Composition. I'm your professor, Stephen Bernard, and today I'm going to be talking about analogies. This is the makeup lecture for Friday, September the 26th, 2025. Today I'm planning to take a deep dive into analogies. I'm going to be doing a quick review of what we did in our last class. And after that, I'd like to give you some more examples of analogies. And by the end of today's lesson, not only should you have a very clear of what I mean when I ask you to make an analogy and what its purpose is, but also be able to evaluate the relative strength or weakness of an analogy. Not all analogies are equal, and although there will always be a certain level of subjectivity when it comes to how strong or weak an analogy is, I would like to give students a framework for evaluating themselves, whether they think an analogy is relatively strong or not. Okay, so let me just bring up my PPT and let's begin. Okay. I like this slide, very cyberpunk. Let's take a look. Okay, so just a quick review of what we did in our last class. First, let's start off with a definition. When I say analogy, what do I actually mean? An analogy is when you say something is like something else. But it's a little bit different, excuse me, from a metaphor or a simile, because an analogy often has a point. We don't just say that A is like B. We say that A is relevantly similar to B in some way, and therefore there's usually some kind of conclusion that you can draw from that. You're trying to make a point. Why would you make this analogy? Because maybe you want people to have a deeper understanding of an idea. Sometimes an analogy can help take a complicated subject and simplify it. Maybe you've got a very complicated thing related to math or engineering or something like that. And then if you want someone who is not familiar with that topic to understand what you mean, you can make an analogy that will make it much easier to understand. If I compare a computer to a brain, for example, that might work. But also analogies can sometimes help us look at things from a fresh perspective. A really good analogy can sometimes help us understand something about life or the world around us in a way that we didn't before. Okay, so if I just quickly read off the slide here. Yeah, A and B are similar in specific ways, so they are alike in one more way. That can be one possible use for an analogy, or because these two things are relatively similar, therefore there's a conclusion that we can draw from that. A is okay, therefore B is okay. Or it could be the opposite. A is not very good, so therefore B is not very good if A and B are relevantly similar. So let's go on. Why use an analogy? Yep, they help explain abstract or complex ideas. They show situations from different perspectives. They can also give us a deeper understanding. It can also be very good for idea generation and help with creativity. And it can also help you memorize things. But let's take a quick look at the analogies that we checked out in our last class. In our last class, I talked a bit about Valentina Tereshkova, who made the analogy of comparing being an astronaut and being a railroad worker. And she said these two things are relatively similar in that, number one, women are capable of being railroad workers in Russia, and being a railroad worker is like being an astronaut. And from this, she drew a conclusion. Therefore, women should be able to go into space as well. Women can be capable astronauts. Now, the point she's trying to make here is at the time, it was almost unheard of for women to be involved in space programs. And she thought this was not right. And she said, listen, we are able to be capable railroad workers. We have proven ourselves in this field. And in her mind, being an astronaut had some relative similarities. Maybe at that time, this is probably the 1960s, so very, very beginning of space exploration, technical knowledge might have been less a requirement than it is now. Obviously, there's a lot more technical knowledge required now. She probably meant both require a great deal of dedication and perseverance and physical stamina, because it's very physically arduous going into space. But if women have been able to show how well they can work on railroads, which is an equally hard, physically demanding job, then they should also be capable astronauts as well. And from that, she drew her conclusion that women should be able to go in space. Now, obviously, being an astronaut and being a railroad worker are not identical. They have very relevant differences too. But for the purpose of her conclusion, the analogy does work, because she's trying to say, because these two jobs are alike in a couple of very specific ways, they could also be similar in another way. And that other way is women should also be allowed to be astronauts. Okay. The second example I have here is Adam Nordwall, also known by his Native American name of Fortunate Eagle, when he went to Italy and he said, I'm taking possession of Italy by right of discovery, the same way Christopher Columbus did. He is actually making an analogy to show that Christopher Columbus's claim to America was not legitimate. When he said, I am taking possession of Italy, he says, listen, this is obviously an outrageous claim. You know, you cannot get off a plane in a country that has been inhabited for thousands of years and then claim ownership by right of discovery. I mean, there are people that are living here and have been living here for thousands of years. So how can you say you are taking ownership by right of discovery? Likewise, Christopher Columbus, when he arrived in the New World, he found a landmass that was inhabited by native people that had been there for a long time, and therefore it is illegitimate for Christopher Columbus to have said that he was taking possession of America, the landmass we now call America, by right of discovery. So when he says my claim that I'm taking possession of Italy is not a fair claim, he's saying likewise, Christopher Columbus's claim is equally illegitimate. Now, once again, these two things are not exactly the same. Going to Italy on a plane in the 21st century and Christopher Columbus coming to the New World several hundred years ago, 600 years ago, about 600 years ago, by boat. These things are obviously very, very different. But for the purpose of his analogy, it works. He's trying to make the claim that both of these claims are similar in a certain way. Both involve somebody going to a far away land that has been inhabited by people and making what he says is a ridiculous claim, the claim to ownership by right of discovery. Christopher Columbus didn't discover America. It was already inhabited. So he could not legitimately make a claim to possession by right of discovery. Likewise, Adam Nordwall was making the claim going to Italy in the 21st century and trying to lay claim to that country would be equally ridiculous. Okay, now when you compare two things and you want to say A is like B, you will need to have a couple of premises to help us get to the conclusion. But remember, your premises must be true. If I go back to Valentina Tereshkova for a second, she said that women have proven themselves to be capable railroad workers in Russia. Is that actually true? If you go and we check and we find out that actually women were not known to be very good railroad workers in Russia at the time, then her analogy would obviously be quite weak. She did not start from a reliable premise. If women had shown themselves to be very capable railroad workers in Russia, that is a reliable premise and therefore strengthens her analogy. So hopefully that clears things up. Remember, A and B don't have to be identical. They have to be relevantly similar in some way. And you have to try to judge, are the relevant similarities stronger than the relative differences? That's a very important point for today, so I'm going to repeat it. When you listen to an analogy or when you make an analogy, you have to think, okay, you have A and B. A and B are not exactly the same, but they have some relative similarities and some relevant differences. Are the similarities greater than the differences, or are the differences, too significant? If the differences are too significant, when you look at the conclusion, oh, these two things don't make sense, the differences are too big, then it's a weak analogy. If the relative strengths or the relative similarities are stronger than the differences, then it's a good analogy. We will take a look at a few analogies and see how can we judge if it is a good analogy or a bad analogy. All right, so let's take a look. I went through this in the previous class. If you want to take a look at the slides, they're there. We talked about, my mom has said life is like a box of chocolates. Obviously, a box of chocolates is a lot different than life, but this is a very fresh and new way of looking at life, and it's a way of coming to an interesting conclusion. Life is like a box of chocolates. Box of chocolates has many different types of chocolate within it, and you don't know what it's going to be until you take a bite. You never know what you're going to get. So there's this level of unpredictability when you choose a chocolate from a box. Likewise, there's a certain measure of unpredictability in life too. And this helps us understand being in this world in a new way. So this is a pretty good analogy. Okay, now at the end of our last class, I gave you these three analogies. The first one is, we all know that people should not drive while they are drunk. Texting while driving is like driving while drunk, in that both make people react more slowly to road hazards. Therefore, people should not text while driving. Now, let's take a look at this analogy. There are a couple of differences. Texting while driving and driving while drunk are not exactly the same. For example, when you drive drunk, you are drunk the whole time. The person cannot stop being drunk while they are driving. They are impaired. It is a condition. They are drunk. However, when somebody texts, this could be a momentary distraction. They might just send a text message for 3 or 4 seconds. And sending a text, which takes a few seconds, in the context of a long drive of 1 or 2 hours, that's a very, very tiny fraction of time that the person is distracted. Whereas if a person is drunk, they will be drunk for the whole time they are driving. That is a relevant difference. However, both texting while driving and driving while drunk are dangerous behaviors, and both can result in the injury or death of not only the driver and other people in the car, but also pedestrians and people in other cars. And there is research to show that texting while driving can greatly increase the chance of a traffic accident. So for the conclusion, people should not text while driving, this analogy is very strong. We know that both of these are dangerous. So just like people should not do A, they shouldn't drive when they're drunk, they also shouldn't text while they're drunk. Okay. Yeah, it's a pretty good analogy. A is not okay. B is therefore B is also not okay. We know that it's not okay to drive while we're drunk because it's much greater chance of car accident and can hurt people, and the person cannot concentrate on the road. Many relevant similarities with texting while drunk. Or sorry, not texting while drunk. Texting while drunk is also a dangerous activity. No, sending a text while driving. There are significant differences, but for the conclusion, it works. Number two, some people argue that there would be fewer mass shootings if more people had guns, especially in the kinds of places where mass shootings occur. But arguing that having more guns will solve the problem of mass shootings is like arguing that smoking more cigarettes will cure lung cancer. Now, I would just like to say that I do not believe having more guns in places where there are mass shootings will help solve the problem of mass shootings. I have heard this argument before. If you have not heard this argument before, let me explain the logic behind it. Let's say university classrooms. There have been some shootings on university campuses in the United States. A person goes into a building, walks into a classroom with a high-powered weapon and kills multiple people with that high-powered weapon. The teacher and the students are completely unarmed, and they have no way to protect themselves. According to the first argument, if the professor and students were allowed to bring guns to class, there would be a much reduced likelihood of a mass shooting. This is because somebody that wants to kill a lot of people does not want to get killed before they accomplish their mission or their goal. So somebody is not going to walk into a university campus or a university classroom and try to shoot people if there's a good chance that the professor and many students in the class are also carrying loaded guns. Mass shooters tend to go to places where people are unarmed and easy victims. So according to this analogy, this argument, if you have more guns in a particular place, it is less likely that a mass shooter, or intending to be a mass shooter, will go there because that they know that people are armed and able to protect themselves. I personally feel this is a flawed argument. However, this analogy is saying that the argument for more guns in places where there are mass shootings is analogous or relevantly similar to arguing that smoking more cigarettes will cure cancer. I would say this is not as strong as the first analogy, and I will explain why. By the way, this is a tweet from Stephen King, and I'm a big Stephen King fan, so it pains me to disagree with him. But Mr. King, I think you're wrong in this case. You can do better than this analogy. What Stephen King is trying to say here is that the first argument the argument that we should have more guns in places where it's likely for mass shootings to occur is similar to the argument that smoking more cigarettes will cause cancer. Stephen King wants to say that both arguments are equally stupid. Both arguments are equally nonsensical. Nobody would argue that smoking cigarettes will cure cancer because that is a stupid argument. It is the cause of the problem. Likewise, arguing that more guns will solve the problem of mass shootings, you are putting in more guns, which is actually the cause of the problem. Just like arguing that having more cigarettes will cure cancer is stupid. Likewise, arguing that more guns in a place will reduce the chance of a mass shooting is equally stupid. Therefore, both arguments are nonsensical, and we should not accept the argument that more guns will solve the problem. However, this is my problem with analogy number 2. Even though the argument for more guns is a flawed argument, in my perspective, there are many people in the United States of America that do make this argument. I have heard it. People have argued that if somebody is planning to shoot many people, they're probably not going to walk into an area where there's a good chance that many people already have a gun. This would reduce the likelihood of mass shootings then if more people have guns in these places. I personally don't agree with that argument, but there are many people who argue from that perspective. However, nobody actually argues that smoking more cigarettes will cause lung cancer. And the fact that nobody actually makes that second argument makes me think that although he's trying to say they are equally stupid, I don't think they are equally stupid because only one of these arguments is actually made by anybody in the world. Nobody actually argues that smoking more cigarettes will cure cancer. So although they are relevantly similar in that both arguments might be flawed, I don't think that they are strongly relevantly similar, because only one argument, the argument for more guns, is something that's actually made. Nobody argues that smoking more cigarettes will cause cancer, and that's a relevant difference. So take that, Mr. King. But you know what? It's not that bad of an analogy because I see what Mr. King is trying to do. A is a stupid argument, so B is a stupid argument, and likewise, A is an equally stupid argument. They're both stupid arguments, so we should reject this idea. However, yeah, not quite as strong as number 1. Number 3, the Earth supports living organisms. Yes, Earth has life. Europa, one of the moons of Jupiter, is like Earth in that both have large oceans of liquid salt water. Therefore, Europa supports living organisms. This is the weakest argument out of the 3. How do we know that it's the weakest argument? Let's look at the conclusion. The conclusion is Europa supports living organisms. That means Europa has life. This moon of Jupiter has life. That is a really strong conclusion to draw. If you're talking about finding life on another planet or moon. But the only evidence that is given, or the only relevant similarity that we have, is that both Earth and Europa have water. Now, for the purposes of this analogy, the person is saying, hey, Earth has oceans of liquid salt water, and Europa also has oceans of salt water, that's a relevant similarity. Earth also has life. So it's got oceans of salt water and it has life. Europa also has oceans of salt water, therefore it must also have life. That does not follow, and that makes this the weakest of the three analogies. The strength of an analogy comes from how well it supports the conclusion. And arguing that Europa has life on it just because it has saltwater oceans like Earth is not a strong analogy. There are many reasons for this. The oceans could be empty, and it's not the saltwater ocean which creates the conditions for life necessarily on Earth. Okay, I would now like to move from those analogies to what I personally think is one of the most astute analogies that I've ever had the good fortune to encounter. When I was growing up, my parents were big fans of the country music star Kenny Rogers, and one of his most famous songs is called The Gambler. And this is an analogy for life. And I think it is one of the best analogies that you can use when thinking about what life is like. There are many analogies that try to help us see life in a fresh and interesting new way. This particular, stop sharing for a second. This particular analogy uses cards. And it says, life is a lot like playing cards. And I put my cards here. When you play cards, you don't know if you're going to win or lose at the end of the game. When you get a few cards, this is called your hand. You get a hand, and every player in the game gets a hand of cards. Now, there are good hands. These are high quality cards. There are bad hands, maybe you have crap cards. But the important thing to remember is the winner is not decided at the beginning of the game. Some people have very good cards, but they lose the game in the end. Other people have very bad cards, but something else comes up in the deck, and then they come out on top. Playing cards, every game is unpredictable in that sense, just like life is unpredictable. Now, what I would like to do is share the lyrics here because I think they actually give a very good insight into life. Obviously, playing cards is not exactly the same as living life, but there are relevant similarities. And I think the lyrics to this song show those relative similarities very well. And I'll explain what I mean. Okay, so I'm not going to sing because I'm tone deaf, but if you would like to hear the song, by all means, check it out on YouTube. This is a classic song. The song is about a young man on a train, and he meets a professional gambler on the train, maybe a professional poker player, and the old man gives the young man some advice on life. And this takes the form of the metaphor that living life is a lot like playing cards. So let me just read this. On a warm summer's evening, on a train bound for nowhere, I met up with a gambler. We were both too tired to sleep. So we both took turns of staring out the window at the darkness till boredom overtook us and he began to speak. He said, "Son, I've made a life out of reading people's faces and knowing what their cards were by the way they held their eyes. So if you don't mind me saying, I can see you're out of aces. For a taste of your whiskey, I'll give you some advice. So what he's saying here is he probably plays poker, and in poker, it's a very important skill to read someone's face. You can tell if they have good cards or bad cards by whether they smile a little bit, the way they move their eyes. And when he says, I can see you are out of aces, he's saying, look, when I look at you, I can see you are down on your luck right now. Things are not going well in your life. But if you give me a little bit of your whiskey, I'll give you some advice about life. So I handed him my bottle, and he drank down my last swallow. Then he bummed a cigarette. So he's like, can I have a cigarette, please? And gives him a cigarette. And then he asked me for a light. And the night got deathly quiet, and his face lost all expression. Said, if you're going to play the game, boy, got to learn to play it right. You got to know when to hold 'em, got to know when to fold 'em, know when to walk away, and know when to run. You never count your money. When you're sitting at the table, there'll be time enough for counting when the dealing's done. Now, every gambler knows that the secret to surviving is knowing what to throw away and knowing what to keep. Because every hand's a winner, every hand is a loser, and the best that you can hope for is to die in your sleep. And when he finished speaking, he turned back toward the window, crushed out his cigarette, and he faded off to sleep. Somewhere in the darkness, the gambler, he broke even. But in his final words, I found an ace that I could keep. So I want to talk a little bit about what this song is actually saying. So the gambler says, you got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, know when to run. This is classic advice that you give to somebody if they're playing poker, especially with a group of strangers. When you've got cards and you're betting money, you've got to know when to hold on to those cards. Maybe your cards don't seem so good, but you think there is some value in here. I better hold on to this. You've got to know when to hold on to something. You've also got to know when to throw it away. Your cards might seem very good at the beginning of the game, but as the game continues, you might realize the situation has changed. You might need to throw those away. And I have to tell you, this is one of the greatest analogies for life that I've ever encountered. I'm 50 years old, and I've met a lot of people in my life, some people that have went on to great success and other people that are no longer with us because they made some very, very poor life decisions. And this advice here, you've got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, know when to run. In life, you can choose to hold on to something or to let it go. And this can be friends, it can be girlfriends, it can be boyfriends, even family members, any type of relationship. You've got to know when to hold on to a relationship, and you've got to know when to let it go. Because your success in life is very much dependent on what you hold and what you throw away. And it's not just the relationships that you have. It could also be certain hobbies or habits. Are there interests in your life that you're going to develop and keep forever? Maybe somebody that is collecting old comic books is eventually going to become a very successful collector and make some money by selling these things. Or if somebody is a musician or something, or a writer or a painter, or maybe they have a problem with drugs or alcohol. Once again, you've got to know what to hold and know what to throw away. Our habits, our behavior, everything that we have in our life, you've got to know when to hold on to something in your life and when it's becoming a burden and when to let it go. And when you are surrounding yourself with people in your life that could be dangerous, you've got to know when to stay with them and when to walk away. And in some cases, you've got to know when to run, because the world also has very dangerous people. And I know a couple of people that are no longer with us because they did not know when to run away. Yeah. Never count your money when you're sitting at the table. There'll be time enough for counting when the dealing's done. Yeah, don't think about how things have, what the result is right now. If the game is still going, don't start counting your money. Don't count your chickens before they hatch. When the game is still in play, don't think that it's over. Don't start counting how much money that you've got or how much you think you've won until it's over, because it ain't over until it's over. Every hand's a winner and every hand's a loser. People are born with different life circumstances. Some people are born very poor, but they become rich. Some people are born into a very rich family, but they have a very poor, sad life, and they die in a very unfortunate way. Every hand is a winner, meaning every hand of cards is a winner. Every hand is potentially a loser too. You don't know what's going to happen necessarily, because every game, just like life, has an element of unpredictability. One important thing to remember also is that when you're playing cards, the most important thing is surviving until the next game starts. Everybody's going to lose a few games of cards. You want to be the person standing there at the end, still be in the game. Some people don't make it to the end of the game. So the best that you can hope for is to die in your sleep. And when he finished speaking, he turned back toward the window. He crushed out his cigarette and he faded off to sleep. Somewhere in the darkness, gambler, he broke even. The gambler dies in his sleep there. He gives his last advice to the young man, crushes out his cigarette, goes to sleep, and then he passes away peacefully, which in his words is the most that anyone can hope for in this life. And in his last words, I found an ace. An ace is the most powerful card, the strongest card in the deck. I found an ace that I can keep. I found a piece of advice that would help me live my life. I think this is an absolutely brilliant song and has an insight into life that few pop songs can match. If you do know a song which has some very interesting advice for life or a cool analogy that you think helps see things in a very different perspective, keeps it fresh, and maybe shows us something that we didn't consider before, leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. Gosh, I'm starting to sound like a YouTuber. Okay, so I'm going to go back to here. Let's bring back. There we go. Hold on just a moment. All right, realize I went off on a tangent there. Let's bring this back up. Okay, don't want to keep everyone here for all day. Hold on. Why can I not? Hold on just a moment. Just going to fix a technical error here. Okay, there we go. Let's bring this up. So let's take a look at these analogies here. Being a student and having a job, your brain and a computer, first-degree murder and euthanasia, cooking a meal and living life, planet Earth and a living organism, and getting married and running a business with a partner. Now, if you wanted to compare one thing to another, these are some pretty interesting analogies. If you wanted to tell someone, you know, being a student and having a job are pretty similar. Really? How so? Well, they both require that you show up on time. I have sometimes made this analogy when students come to class late frequently. Why are you late? Oh, sorry about that. I had to do something. Would you turn up late for your job too? No. Well, guess what? If you turn up late for your job, you will get fired. So I think that showing up to class on time is sort of preparing young people for what they will eventually face in the workforce. So if I were to talk about the importance of showing up to work on time, I might make the analogy that being a student and having a job are relevantly similar in that way. It's very important that you learn to show up on time. Your brain and a computer. There's some very interesting similarities and differences here too. Depending on your conclusion, you could look at different similarities and differences and say that, you know what, your brain is a lot like a computer. The only big difference is it's a lot harder to retrieve those older files. First-degree murder and euthanasia. I've heard this sometimes when people talk euthanasia in Korean alaksa or mercy killing. This is when someone who is terminally ill, usually with cancer or a similar disease, they want to end their lives early. They want to do this with medical assistance. So it's sometimes called doctor-assisted suicide. And it's a very controversial topic. Some countries have legalized this, other countries have not. I believe my home country of Canada has legalized it. I don't have any plans for this yet. I haven't done it. But yeah, euthanasia. Some people that argue against euthanasia say, listen, doctors can not or should not be allowed to assist people in dying. And they make the analogy that euthanasia is a lot like first-degree murder. Now, there are some relevant similarities here. With euthanasia and first-degree murder, both involve the intentional death of another human being. First-degree murder is when you plan to kill somebody and then you kill them. So you hate somebody and then you make a plan. I'm going to kill that person. And then you kill them. It is your intention. It's your purpose. That is relevantly similar to euthanasia in that when a doctor helps someone end their life, they are not doing this by accident. The person is going to die, and it is the doctor's actions are intentionally leading to that person dying. However, a very relevant difference is that first-degree murder is non-consensual. When somebody commits first-degree murder, the victim does not give their consent. They are killed against their will. In euthanasia, however, the person is actively seeking medical assistance to end their life. And that is a relevant similarity, one that is very strong, and I think makes the argument that first-degree murder is like euthanasia or euthanasia is like first-degree murder. I think that weakens the analogy quite a bit. Getting married and running a business with a partner. Both marriage and running a business with a partner involve long-term commitment, require great loyalty and trust. Both are legally binding relationships. When you are, co-owners of a company, that is definitely a legally binding relationship. Likewise, a marriage is also a legally binding relationship. Both running a business with a partner and being married require compromise. The ability to listen also requires a great deal of problem-solving skills. And hopefully the relationship between the two business owners, as well as a husband and wife, will get stronger as the years go by. Of course, there are some relevant differences too. Getting married is often based on the idea of mutual attraction or love. And running a business with a partner is a strictly professional relationship. At least it should be. Okay, if we actually had class today, one of the activities is I would put you into groups, and each group would look at a couple of different comparisons and then try and list some relative similarities and differences. You could come up with a conclusion. Cooking a meal is a lot like life in that, and then you'd give me your conclusion. You give me a couple of similarities and differences, and then we could discuss whether the analogy was strong or not so strong. But this is just a makeup lecture, so keep that in your mind. Do it as a mental exercise. Next, okay. Oh, so cute. You're probably thinking, is Mr. Barnard saying that the baby is cute or the puppy is cute? All right, now, one of the arguments that we looked at in an earlier class is, does raising a pet or taking care of a pet, having a pet, does that help prepare you for raising children? What are a couple of similarities and what are a couple of differences? Well, let's take a look at a short paragraph that evaluates whether having a pet and raising a baby are relatively similar or relatively different. Adopting a dog is like having a child in that both require taking responsibility for another living being. So sentence number one identifies a relative similarity. Also, they can both turn your house into a big mess. Okay, so we've got two relevant similarities. On the other hand, having a child involves a lot more responsibility, relevant difference, creates a much longer commitment, second relevant difference, and eventually leads to there being another adult human being in the world. That is a third relevant difference. Now, depending on the conclusion that you want to make, this analogy will be either stronger or weaker. But I would say in a limited sense, it can be an effective analogy because you are taking responsibility for another living being. However, if somebody tries to say that, look, I know what it's like to raise a child because I have a pet dog, I think in that case, the analogy would be relatively weak. Okay, now I would like to give you an example of an analogy, and I also want to show you a paragraph that evaluates how strong the analogy is. It will look at the relative similarities, look at the relative differences, and then decide if the analogy is relatively strong or weak. Are the relative similarities stronger, or are the relative differences stronger? So let's take a look. A store owner had an unusual way of punishing shoplifters. When he caught a shoplifter, the store owner threatened to call the police unless the shoplifter gave him a shoe. Give me one of your shoes or I call the cops. Yeah, no, there we go. I'll call the cops. After giving up a shoe, most shoplifters were too embarrassed to return to the store. So this was the shopkeeper's way of, reducing the amount of shoplifting. Somebody steals something, they got to give up a shoe. They're probably not going to come back to the store. However, police used the following argument to stop the owner from doing this. They said demanding a shoe in return for not calling the police is like demanding $20 in return for not calling the police. So they're saying, by asking for a shoe, you're basically robbing the person, just like you would if you were to demand $20 in return for not calling the police. Both demanding a shoe and demanding $20, both involve threatening someone to give up something of value. It would be a form of robbery to demand $20 in return for not calling the police. I believe this crime is called extortion. Therefore, it is a form of robbery to demand a shoe in return for not calling the police. Okay, so this is, according to the police, the argument that the police are giving, the shop owner is not allowed to threaten the shoplifter with calling the police unless they give up a shoe, because doing that is a form of robbery. If he were to insist on $20 for not calling the police, that would be similar to him asking for a shoe or demanding a shoe. Now, if we had a regular class today, I would ask you and your partners to decide if you think these two things are relevantly similar enough to make this a strong argument, or do you think that the relevant differences are so great that the the analogy is not so strong. I did this with one of my classes. It was quite interesting. There's a split decision. Some people said the relevant similarities were stronger. Some people said the relevant differences were stronger. In the end, though, the police's argument will take precedence because they have the authority. Let's take a look at a paragraph that examines this analogy and evaluates the relative strength and weaknesses of each. Okay. So some important questions to ask. Is the analogy relatively strong or weak? How are the similarities different? Tell me. What is a relevant difference? And do the similarities outweigh the differences? This is the hard part, trying to make some kind of judgment. Similarity is greater or the difference is greater? Let's take a look at a single paragraph example. And this is something I'll be asking you about for your probably either your second writing assignment or this might go on the midterm exam. Okay. This is a fairly strong argument because demanding $20 and demanding a shoe are relevantly similar. Both involve threatening the shoplifter with harm, in this case arrest, unless they give up something of value. Since threatening someone to give you money is what makes mugging a form of robbery, this similarity is relative to the conclusion that demanding a shoe is robbery. There is a relevant difference, however. The shoe owner could spend the $20, but he can't do anything with one shoe. And this is relevant because it makes it clear that the owner's goal is not personal gain, but to deter shoplifting, to discourage shoplifting. Nevertheless, the difference does not change the fact that demanding a shoe is relevantly like robbery, since giving up a shoe is still a loss for the shoplifter. And that's the key similarity. It's still a loss for the shoplifter. I mean, taking money by force is still robbery, even if the robber donates it to charity or some other selfish act. So yeah, it doesn't matter whether there is like an inherent, it doesn't matter if there's a profit motive. The store owner is not going to profit from having the shoe, but it wouldn't matter if he robbed if he insisted on $20, and even if he didn't keep that $20, if he donated that to charity, that would still be robbery. And that makes the analogy here quite strong. Now, I want you to take particular attention to the structure of this paragraph. And this is what I'll be looking at when you compare the relative strengths and weaknesses of an analogy, either for your second writing homework or possibly for possibly on the midterm exam. We shall see. All right, so I've color-coded this here. Let's take a look at each sentence and see what it does. So the green sentence, the first sentence, this is a fairly strong argument because demanding $20 and demanding a shoe are relevantly similar. This gives us the overall evaluation. It's a relatively strong argument. Next, both involve threatening the shoplifter with harm unless they give something of value. Since threatening someone to give you money is what makes mugging a form of robbery, this similarity is relevant to the conclusion that demanding a shoe is robbery. Okay, here we get the relevant similarity, the strongest relevant similarity. Both involve threatening the shopper with harm. In this case, getting arrested by the police unless they give up something of value. So both are going to involve some kind of loss for the shoplifter. And this is relevant because demanding a shoe is robbery, according to the police. Okay, now on to the blue. There is a relevant difference, however. Remember, this is not one-sided. There's relevant similarities and differences on both sides. There is a relevant difference, however. The store owner could spend the $20, but he can't do anything with one shoe. And this is relevant because it makes it clear that the owner's goal is not personal gain, but to deter shoplifting. Yes, here we get the relevant difference. You know, asking for $20 and asking for a shoe, demanding a shoe or demanding $20, these two things are quite different. I mean, you can benefit from $20. You can spend the money. It's cash. That shoe is worthless. And here we get the key difference. This is the shop owner's intention. The shop owner just wants to discourage shoplifting. They're not trying to profit. Okay, finally, now we get the brown. Nevertheless, that difference does not change the fact that demanding a shoe is relevantly like robbery, since giving up a shoe is still a loss. This is the key strength of this argument. Whether the shoplifter gives up a shoe or they give up $20, they are both being threatened with some kind of harm, getting arrested by the police, unless they give up something of value. And that threat and the insistence on getting something in return, like whether a shoe or $20, both involve a loss for the shoplifter. And you're taking it by force because you're threatening them with harm. If I take a gun and I say, okay, give me $20 or give me your shoe, you will give me the shoe or you will give me the $20. You're not doing it by choice. You are being forced to. So taking money or taking something of value by force is still robbery, even if the robber donates it to a charity or some other selfless act. So it doesn't matter what the store owner plans to do with the shoe, or if it were $20. The fact is they still took something of value from the shoplifter, and then, their plan on what they're going to do with that, that's not relevant. The relevant part is they're doing this in order to make the shoplifter lose something of value. And when you force someone to lose something of value, that is the definition of robbery. All right. And now I'm going to finish today's lecture with one more example. And this is something I'd like you to think about for our class next Wednesday. I will quickly review this at the beginning of class on Wednesday, and then I'll put you into groups, and I'd love to hear whether you think this is a relatively strong analogy or relatively weak analogy. You and your partners next Wednesday will look at this analogy, brainstorm a couple of similarities, brainstorm a couple of differences, and then try and decide whether this analogy is relatively strong or not. So let's take a look. Imagine walking by a shallow pond and you see a child drowning. You can save the child at no risk to yourself, but you would ruin your shoes. If you don't do anything, the child will die. It would be wrong to let the child die just to avoid ruining your shoes. But we all do something like this every day. We could save the lives of children in developing countries by donating relatively small amounts of money to organizations like Oxfam, CARE. Not donating money to organizations like these is like letting a child drown in a shallow pond. Therefore, it's wrong not to donate to international relief organizations. Okay, so let's take a look at this analogy very quickly before I finish the lecture. The person makes the argument that it is morally wrong, it is unethical, if we don't donate relatively small amounts of money to international relief organizations. We should donate at least relatively small amounts of money to international relief organizations because it will save the lives of children, at least children, hopefully older people too. Now, this person is comparing making a donation to an international organization like a Oxfam, CARE, World Vision, some aid organization, and saving a child that is drowning in a relatively shallow pond. If you go into the pond and you save the child, there will be a financial cost. They'll probably ruin your shoes and you'll have to buy a new pair of shoes, but you've saved the child's life. When you donate money to an organization, there's a financial cost, but you're also going to end up saving people's lives. So they are saying these things are relatively similar in that way. If you donate money to an international aid organization, this is like saving a child in a drought that is drowning in a shallow pond. If you don't donate to international aid organizations, then that's like letting the child that is drowning in a pond go under the water and die. Therefore, it's wrong not to donate to international aid or international relief organizations. Okay, now, how relevantly similar or relevantly different are these two things? Letting a child drown in a pond or saving the child compared to donating or not donating to an international aid organization. This is an interesting argument. So I would be very, very interested to hear what you come up with. This is what we're going to do at the very beginning of class next Wednesday, which I believe is October the 1st. Okay. All right. So I'm going to finish our lecture now. Thank you very much for staying here to the end. I hope I didn't ramble on for too long. If you don't understand any part of this lecture, if there was anything that was difficult to comprehend, if there's any point that you would like me to explain in more detail, if there's anything that I can help you with, please put a question into the group chat, and I will do my best to explain it. Sometimes when I talk, I tend to go on and on for a little bit, and I wonder if I go off the topic. So if you need a short, concise explanation regarding anything in this lecture, please put your question into the group chat on Cacao Work, and I will do my best to answer it as well as I can. Thank you very, very much. I hope you enjoy the festival today. Have a great weekend, and I will see everybody next Wednesday. Bye-bye.